Hello everyone, welcome to my fourth Halloween reading live stream. Today is the special day, and I will be reading the rest of the Halloween stories. I know last night, after having a sip of water, actually forgot to unmute my microphone, and I was carrying on reading out loud for 5 minutes until I decided to finish the stream. No one could hear me because I realised I still had myself on mute. So I'm going to make sure that will not happen again. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. And if you wish to donate, my Streamlabs link is in the description. Okay, I'm going to continue with reading the rest of Sleepy Hollow, and just to the bit where we left off before I ended up muting myself to have a sip of water. Alright then. Hello, Dr. Fowl. Happy Halloween. Hi, Candy S. Happy Halloween to you as well. Okay. I know where we were left off. There it is. Alright. Let's continue, shall we? About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran into a marshy and thickly wooded glen known by the name of Wiley Swamp. A few rough logs laid side by side served for a bridge over this stream. On that side of the road where the brook entered the wood, a group of oaks and chestnuts, matted thick with wild grapevines, threw a cavernous gloom over it. To pass this bridge was the severest trial. It was at this identical spot that the unfortunate Andre was captured, and under the covert of those chestnuts and vines were the sturdy yeomen concealed who surprised him. This has ever since been considered a haunted stream, and fearful are the feelings of the schoolboy who has to pass it alone after dark. Oh, no problem, I'll turn down the music, I'm sorry. As he approached the stream, his heart began to thump. He summoned up, however, all his resolution, gave his horse half a score of kicks in the ribs, and attempted to dash briskly across the bridge, but instead of starting forward, the perverse old animal made a lateral movement and ran broadside against the fence, whose fears increased with the delay, jerked the reins on the other side, and kicked lustily with the contrary foot. It was all in vain. His steed started, it is true, but it was only to plunge to the opposite side of the road into a thicket of brambles and alder bushes. The schoolmaster now bestowed both whip and heel upon the starveling ribs of old Gunpowder, who dashed forward, snuffling and snorting, but came to a stand just by the bridge, with a suddenness that had nearly sent his rider sprawling over his head. Just at this moment, a plashy tramp by the side of the bridge caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. In the dark shadow of the grove, on the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge, misshapen and towering. It stirred not, but seemed gathered up in the gloom, like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon the traveller. You're welcome, Dr. Fell. That's good to know that the sound is fine now. The hair of the affrighted pedagogue rose upon his head with terror. What was to be done? To turn and fly was now too late, and besides, what chance was there of escaping ghost or goblin, if such it was, which could ride upon the wings of the wind? Summoning up, therefore, a show of courage, he demanded in stammering accents, "Who are you?" He received no reply. He repeated his demand in a still more agitated voice. Still there was no answer. Once more he cudgelled the sides of the inflexible gunpowder and, shutting his eyes, broke forth with involuntary fervour into a psalm tune. Just then the shadowy object of alarm put itself in motion, and with a scramble and a bound stood at once in the middle of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, yet the form of the unknown might now in some degree be ascertained. He appeared to be a horseman of large dimensions, and mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. He made no offer of molestation or sociability, but kept aloof on one side of the road, jogging along on the blind side of old Gunpowder, who had now got over his fright and waywardness. Ichabod, who had no relish for this strange midnight companion, and bethought himself of the adventure of Brombones with the galloping Hessian, now quickened his steed in hopes of leaving him behind. The stranger, however, quickened his horse to an equal pace. Ichabod pulled up, and felt to lag behind. The other did the same. His heart began to sink within him. He endeavoured to resume his psalm tune, but his parched tongue clove to the roof of his mouth, and he could not utter a stave. There was something in the moody and dogged silence of this pertinacious companion that was mysterious and appalling. It was soon fearfully accounted for. On mounting a rising ground, which brought the figure of his fellow traveller in relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless, but his horror was still more increased on observing that the head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of his saddle. His terror rose to desperation. He rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping by a sudden movement to give his companion the slip. But the spectre started full jump with him. Away then they dashed through thick and thin, stones flying and sparks flashing at every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air as he stretched his long lank body away over his horse's head in the eagerness of his flight. They had now reached which turns off to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, who seemed possessed with a demon, instead of keeping up it, made an opposite turn and plunged headlong downhill to the left. This road leads through a sandy hollow shaded by trees for about a quarter of a mile, where it crosses the bridge famous in Goblin story, and just beyond swells the green knoll on which stands the whitewashed church. As yet, the panic of the steed had given his unskilful rider an apparent advantage in the chase, but just as he had got halfway through the hollow, the girths of the saddle gave way, and he felt it slipping from under him. He seized it by the pommel, and endeavoured to hold it firm, but in vain, and had just time to save himself by clasping old Gunpowder round the neck, when the saddle fell to the earth, and he heard it trampled under foot by his pursuer. For a moment the terror of Hans Van Ripper's wrath passed across his mind, for it was his Sunday saddle. But this was no time for petty fears. The goblin was hard on his haunches, and, unskilful rider that he was, he had much ado to maintain his seat, sometimes slipping on one side, sometimes on another, and sometimes jolted on the high ridge of the horse's backbone with a violence that he verily feared would cleave him asunder. An opening in the trees now cheered him with the hopes that the church bridge was at hand. The wavering reflection of a silver star in the bosom of the brook told him that he was not mistaken. He saw the walls of the church dimly glaring under the trees beyond. He recollected the place where Brombone's ghostly competitor had disappeared. "If I can but reach that bridge," thought Ichabod, "I am safe." Just then he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. He even fancied that he felt his hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs, and old Gunpowder upon the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks. He gained the opposite side, and now Ichabod cast a look behind to see if his pursuer should vanish according to rule, in a flash of fire and brimstone. Just then he saw the goblin rising in his stirrups, and in the very act of hurling his head at him. Ichabod endeavoured to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. It encountered his crane's crash. He was tumbled headlong into the dust, and Gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning the old horse was found without his saddle, and with the bridle under his feet, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make his appearance at breakfast. Dinner hour came, but no Ichabod. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse, and strolled idly about the banks of the brook, but no schoolmaster. Hans Van Ripper now began to feel some uneasiness about the fate of poor Ichabod and his saddle. An inquiry was set on foot, and after diligent investigation they came upon his traces. In one part of the road leading to the church was found the saddle trampled in the dirt, the tracks of horses' hoofs deeply dented in the road, and evidently at furious speed, were traced to the bridge, beyond which, on the bank of a broad part of the brook, where the water ran deep and black, was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but the body of the schoolmaster was not to be discovered. Hans Van Ripper, as executor of his estate, examined the bundle which contained all his worldly effects. They consisted of 2 shirts and a half, 2 socks for the neck, a pair or 2 of worsted stockings, an old pair of corduroy small clothes, a rusty razor, a book of psalm tunes full of dog's ears, and a broken pitch pipe. As to the books and furniture of the schoolhouse, they belonged to the community, excepting Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, a New England Almanac, and a book of dreams and fortune-telling, in which last was a sheet of foolscap, much scribbled and blotted in several fruitless attempts to make a copy of verses in honour of the heiress of Van Tassel. These magic books and the poetic scroll were forthwith consigned to the flames by Hans van Ripper, who from that time forward determined to send his children no more to school, observing that he never knew any good come of this same reading and writing. Whatever money the schoolmaster possessed, and he had received his quarter's pay but a day or two before, he must have had about his person at the time of his disappearance. The mysterious event caused much speculation at the church on the following Sunday. Knots of gazers and gossips were collected in the churchyard, at the bridge, and at the spot where the hat and pumpkin had been found. The stories of Brewer, of Bones, and a whole budget of others were called to mind, and when they had diligently considered them all, and compared them with the symptoms of the present case, they shook their heads, and came to the conclusion that Ichabod had been carried off by the galloping Hessian. As he was a bachelor, and in nobody's debt, head any more about him. The school was removed to a different quarter of the hollow, and another pedagogue reigned in his stead. It is true, an old farmer who had been down to New York on a visit several years after, and from whom this account of the ghostly adventure was received, brought home the intelligence that Ichabod Crane was still alive, that he had left the neighbourhood partly through fear of the goblin and Hans van Ripper, and partly in mortification at having been suddenly dismissed by the heiress, that he had changed his quarters to a distant part of the country, had kept school and studied law at the same time, had been admitted to the bar, turned politician, electioneered, written for the newspapers, and finally had been made a justice of the £10 court. Brom Bones, too, who, shortly after his rival's disappearance, conducted the blooming Katrina in triumph to the altar, was observed to look exceedingly knowing whenever the story of Ichabod was related, and always burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, which led some to suspect that he knew more about the matter than he chose to tell. The old country wives, however, who are the best judges of these matters, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means, and it is a favourite story often told about the neighbourhood round the winter evening fire. The bridge became a more than ever an object of superstitious awe, and that may be the reason why the road had been altered of late years so as to approach the church by the pond. The schoolhouse, being deserted, soon fell to decay, and was reported to be haunted by the ghost of the unfortunate pedagogue and the ploughboy, loitering homeward of a still summer evening, has often fancied his voice at a distance, chanting a melancholy psalm tune among the tranquil solitudes of Sleepy Hollow. Postscript, found in the handwriting of Mr. Knickerbocker. The preceding tale is given almost in the precise words in which I heard it relate at a corporation meeting at the ancient city of Manhattoes, at which were present many of its sagest and most illustrious burghers. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that word. Oops. Illustrious burghers. The narrator was a pleasant, shabby, gentlemanly old fellow in pepper and salt clothes, with a sadly humorous face, strongly suspected of being poor. He made such efforts to be entertaining. When his story was concluded, there was much laughter and approbation, particularly from 2 or 3 deputy aldermen, who had been asleep the greater part of the time. There was, however, one tall, dry-looking old gentleman with beetling eyebrows, who made the severe face throughout, now and then folding his arms, inclining his head, and looking down upon the floor as if turning a doubt over his mind. He was one of your wary men, who never laugh when they have reason and law on their side. When the mirth of the rest of the company had subsided and silence was restored, he leaned one arm on the elbow of his chair, and sticking the other akimbo, demanded with a slight but exceedingly sage motion of the head and of the brow what was the moral of the story and what it went to prove. The was just putting a glass of wine to his lips as a refreshment after his toils, paused for a moment, looked at his inquirer with an air of infinite deference, and, lowering the glass slowly to the table, observed that the story was intended most logically to prove that there is no situation in life but has its advantages and pleasures, provided we will but take a joke as we find it. That, therefore, he that runs troopers is likely to have rough riding of it. Ergo, for a country schoolmaster to be refused the hand of a Dutch heiress is a certain step to high preferment in the state. The cautious old gentleman knit his brows tenfold closer after this explanation, being sorely puzzled by the of the syllogism, while methought the one in pepper and salt eyed him with something leer. At length this was very well, but still he thought the story a little on the extravagant. There were 1 or 2 points on which he had his doubts. Faith, sir, replied the storyteller, as to that matter, I don't believe one half of it myself. D.K. The end. Wow, there you go. That was very interesting. Okay, I'll just see what else there was. I was recommended by other people what I should read. Yes, I did read The Cask of Amontillado. I think that's on my first Halloween reading stream. Yeah, it is. Excuse me. Oh, just a moment, everyone. Hello, I'm back. Right, what other Halloween stories could I read next? Let me pause this for the moment. I know that Diana Gray recommended me to read some stories by Mr. Davis on YouTube. Just seeing which one would look good. I mean, I'm only interested in fiction. Don't think I want to read something that are based off a true story. Well, I'll just see for some other Edgar Allan Poe Halloween stories. Just go away. Don't like you. I'll just look up some of these words. I'm going to read the premature burial. Alrighty. Let's continue. The Premature Burial by Edgar Allan Poe, published 1850. There are certain themes of which the interest is all-absorbing, but which are too entirely horrible for the purpose of legitimate fiction. These the mere romanticist must eschew, if he do not wish to offend or to disgust. They are with propriety handled only when the severity and majesty of truth sanctify and sustain them. We thrill, for example, with the most intense of pleasurable pain, over the accounts of the passage of the Beresina, of the earthquake at Lisbon, of the plague at London, of the massacre of St. Bartholomew, or of the stifling of the 123 prisoners in the Black Hole at Calcutta. But in these accounts it is the fact, it is the reality, it is the history which excites. As inventions we should regard them with simple abhorrence. I have mentioned some few of the more prominent and august calamities on record, but in these it is the extent not less than the character of the calamity which so vividly impresses the fancy. I need not to remind the reader that from the long and weird catalogue of human miseries I might have selected many individual instances more replete with essential suffering than any of these vast generalities of disaster. The true wretchedness, indeed, the ultimate woe, is particular, not diffuse, that the ghastly extremes of agony are endured by man the unit, and never by man the mass. For this let us thank a merciful God. To be buried while alive is, beyond question, the most terrific of these extremes which has ever fallen to the lot of mere mortality, that it has frequently, very frequently, so fallen will scarcely be denied by those who think. The boundaries which divide life from death are at best shadowy and vague. Who shall say where the one ends and where the other begins? We know that there are diseases in which occur total cessations of all the apparent functions of vitality, and yet in which these cessations are merely suspensions, properly so called. They are only temporary pauses in the incomprehensible mechanism. A certain period elapses, and some unseen, mysterious principle again sets in motion the magic pinions and the wizard wheels. The silver cord was not forever loosed, nor the golden bowl irreparably broken. But where, meantime, was the soul? Apart, however, from the inevitable conclusion, a priori, that such causes must produce such effects, that the well-known occurrence of such cases of suspended animation must naturally give rise, now and then, to premature interments. Apart from this consideration, we have the direct testimony of medical and ordinary experience to prove that a vast number of such interments have actually taken place. I might refer at once, if necessary, to 100 well authenticated instances, one of very remarkable character, and of which the circumstances may be fresh in the memory of some of my readers, occurred not very long ago, in the neighbouring city of Baltimore, where it occasioned a painful, intense, and widely extended excitement. The wife of one of the citizens, a lawyer of eminence and a member of Congress, was seized with a sudden and unaccountable illness which completely baffled the skill of her physicians. After much suffering she died, or was supposed to die. No one suspected, indeed, or had reason to suspect, that she was not actually dead. She presented all the ordinary appearances of death. The face assumed the usual pinched and sunken outline. The lips were of the usual marble pallor. The eyes were lustreless. There was no warmth. Pulsation had ceased. For 3 days the body was preserved unburied, during which it had acquired a stony rigidity. The funeral, in short, was hastened on account of the rapid advance of what was supposed to be decomposition. The lady was deposited in her family vault, which for 3 subsequent years was undisturbed. At the expiration of this term it was opened for the reception of a sarcophagus, but alas, how fearful a shock awaited the husband, who personally threw open the door. As its portal swung outwardly back, some white apparelled object fell rattling within his arms. It was the skeleton of his wife in her yet unmoulded shroud. A careful investigation rendered it evident that she had revived within 2 days after her entombment, that her struggles within the coffin had caused it to fall from a ledge or shelf to the floor, where it was so broken as to permit her escape. A lamp which had been accidentally left full of oil within the tomb was found empty. It might have been exhausted, however, by evaporation. On the uttermost of the steps which led down into the dread chamber was a large fragment of the coffin, with which it seemed that she had endeavoured to arrest attention by striking the iron door. While thus occupied, she probably swooned or possibly died through sheer terror, and in failing, her shroud became entangled in some iron work which projected interiorly. Thus she remained, and thus she rotted, erect. In the year 1810, a case of living inhumation happened in France, attended with circumstances which go far to warrant the assertion that truth is, indeed, stranger than fiction. The heroine of the story was Mademoiselle Victorine Lafourcade, a young girl of illustrious family, of wealth, and of great personal beauty. Among her numerous suitors was Julien Bossuet, a poor literature or journalist of Paris, His talents and general amiability had recommended him to the notice of the heiress, by whom he seemed to have been truly beloved, but her pride of birth decided her finally to reject him, and to wed a Monsieur Renelle, a banker and a diplomatist of some eminence. After marriage, however, this gentleman neglected and perhaps even more positively ill-treated her. Having passed with him some wretched years, she died. At least her condition so closely resembled death as to deceive everyone who saw her. She was buried, not in a vault, but in an ordinary grave in the village of her nativity. Filled with despair, and still inflamed by the memory of a profound attachment, the lover journeys from the capital to the remote province in which the village lies, with the romantic purpose of disinterring the corpse, and possessing himself of its luxuriant tresses. He reaches the grave. At midnight, he unearths the coffin, opens it, and is in the act of detaching the hair when he is arrested by the unclosing. Sorry, I'm trying to find where I am. When he is arrested by the unclosing of the beloved eyes. In fact, the lady had been buried alive. Vitality had not altogether departed, and she was aroused by the caresses of her lover from the lethargy which had been mistaken for death. He bore her frantically to his lodgings in the village. He employed certain powerful restoratives suggested by no little medical learning. In fine, she revived. She recognized her preserver. She remained with him until, by slow degrees, she fully recovered her original health. Her woman's heart was not adamant, and this last lesson of love sufficed to soften it. She bestowed it upon Bossuet. She returned no more to her husband, but concealing from him her resurrection, fled with her lover to America. 20 years afterward, the two returned to France. in the persuasion that time had so greatly altered the lady's appearance that her friends would be unable to recognise her. They were mistaken, however, for at the first meeting, Monsieur Renelle did actually recognise and make claim to his wife. This claim she resisted, and the judicial tribunal sustained her in her resistance, deciding that the peculiar circumstances, with the long lapse of years, had extinguished, not only equitably but legally, the authority of the husband. The Chirurgical Journal of Leipzig, a periodical of high authority and merit, which some American bookseller would do well to translate and republish, records in a late number a very distressing event of the character in question. An officer of artillery, a man of gigantic stature, of robust health, being thrown from an unimaginable horse, received by severe contusion upon the head, which rendered him insensible at once. The skull was slightly fractured, but no immediate danger was apprehended. Trepanning was accomplished successfully. He was bled, and many other of the ordinary means of relief were adopted. Gradually, however, he fell into a more and more hopeless state of stupor, and finally it was thought that he died. The weather was warm, and he was buried with incident haste in one of the public cemeteries. His funeral took place on Thursday. On the Sunday following, the grounds of the cemetery were, as usual, much thronged with visitors, and about noon an intense excitement was created by the declaration of a peasant that, while sitting upon the grave of the officer, he had distinctly felt a commotion of the earth, as if occasioned by some one struggling beneath. At first, little attention was paid to the man's asseveration, but his evident terror and the dogged obstinacy with which he persisted in his story had at length their natural effect upon the crowd. Spades were hurriedly procured, and the grave, which was shamefully shallow, was in a few minutes so far thrown open at the head of its occupant appeared. He was then seemingly dead, but he sat nearly erect within his coffin, the lid of which, in his furious struggles, he had partially uplifted. He was forthwith conveyed to the nearest hospital, and there pronounced to still be living, though in an asphytic condition. After some hours he revived, recognized individuals of his acquaintance, and in broken sentences spoke of his agonies in the grave. From what he related, it was clear that he must have been conscious of life for more than an hour while inhumed, before lapsing into insensibility. The grave was carelessly and loosely filled with an exceedingly porous soil, and thus some air was necessarily admitted. He heard the footsteps of the crowd overhead, and endeavoured to make himself heard in turn. It was the tumult within the grounds of the cemetery, he said, which appeared to awaken him from a deep sleep. But no sooner was he awake than he became fully aware of the awful horrors of his position. This patient, it is recorded, was doing well and seemed to be in a fair way of ultimate recovery, but fell a victim to the quackeries of medical experiment. The galvanic battery was applied, and he suddenly expired in one of those ecstatic paroxysms which occasionally it superinduces. The mention of the galvanic battery nevertheless recalls to my memory a well-known and very extraordinary case in point where its action proved the means of restoring to animation a young attorney of London who had been interred for 2 days. This occurred in 1831 and created, at the time, a very profound sensation wherever it was made the subject of converse. The patient, Mr. Edward Stapleton, had died, apparently of typhus fever, accompanied with some anomalous symptoms which had excited the curiosity of his medical attendants. Upon his seeming decease, his friends were requested to sanction a post-mortem examination, but declined to permit it. As often happens when such refusals are made, the practitioners resolve to disinter the body and dissect it at leisure in private. Arrangements were easily effected with some of the numerous corps of body snatchers with which London abounds, and upon the 3rd night after the funeral the supposed corpse was unearthed from a grave 8 feet deep and deposited in the opening chamber of one of the private hospitals. An incision of some extent had been actually made in the abdomen, when the fresh and undecayed appearance of the subject suggested an application of the battery. One experiment succeeded another, and the customary effects supervened, with nothing to characterize them in any respect except upon 1 or 2 occasions a more than ordinary degree of lifelikeness in the convulsive action. It grew late, the day was about to dawn, and it was thought expedient at length to proceed at once to the dissection. A student, however, was especially desirous of testing a theory of his own, and insisted upon applying the battery to one of the pectoral muscles. A rough gash was made, and a wire hastily brought in contact, when the patient, with a hurried but quite unconvulsive movement, arose from the table, stepped into the middle of the floor, gazed about him uneasily for a few seconds, and then spoke. What he said was unintelligible, but words were uttered. The syllabification was distinct. Having spoken, he fell heavily to the floor. For some moments all were paralysed with awe, but the urgency of the case soon restored them their presence of mind. It was seen that Mr. Stapleton was alive, although in a swoon. Upon exhibition of ether he revived and was rapidly restored to health and to the society of his friend, from whom, however, all knowledge of his resuscitation was withheld, until a relapse was no longer to be apprehended. Their wonder, their rapturous astonishment may be conceived. The most thrilling peculiarity of this incident, nevertheless, is involved in what Mr. S. himself asserts. He declares that at no period was he altogether insensible, that dully and confusedly he was aware of everything which happened to him, from the moment in which he was pronounced dead by his physicians, to that in which he fell swooning to the floor of the hospital. "I am alive," were the uncomprehended words which, upon recognising the locality of the dissecting room, he had endeavoured in his extremity to utter. It were an easy matter to multiply such histories as these, but I forbear, for indeed we have no need of such to establish the fact that premature interments occur. When we reflect how very rarely, from the nature of the case, we have it in our power to detect them, we must admit that they may frequently occur without our cognizance. And I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Just a moment. Cognizance. Okay. Hi, by the way, Christy in AZ. Happy that you're here. Awesome. I think this is the first time of you coming here. I'm glad that you have arrived. And hello, Diana Gray. Okay. Cognizance. Scarcely in truth is a graveyard ever enroached upon for any purpose to any great extent, that skeletons are not found in postures which suggest the most fearful of suspicions. Fearful indeed the suspicion, but more fearful the doom. It may be asserted without hesitation that no event is so terrible. The endurable oppression of the lungs, the stifling fumes from the damp earth, the clinging to the death garments, the rigid embrace of the narrow house, the blackness of the absolute night, the silence like a sea that overwhelms, the unseen but palpable presence of the conqueror worm. These things, with the thoughts of the air and grass above, with memory of dear friends who would fly to save us if but informed of our fate, and with consciousness that of this fate they can never be in, that our hopeless portion is that of the really dead. These considerations, I say, carry into the heart, which still palpitates, a degree of appalling and intolerable horror. The imagination must recoil. We know of nothing so agonizing upon earth. We can dream of nothing half so hideous in the realms of the nethermost hell. And thus all narratives upon this topic have an interest profound, an interest nevertheless which through the scared awe of the topic itself very properly and very peculiarly depends upon our conviction of the truth of the matter narrated. What I have now to tell is of my own actual knowledge, of my own positive and personal experience. Oh, Christy Newsom. Oh, that's fantastic. Hello, Christy. How have you been? For several years I had been subject to attacks of the singular disorder which physicians have agreed to term catalepsy, in default of a more definitive title. Although both the immediate and the predisposing causes and even the actual diagnosis of this disease are still mysterious, its obvious and apparent character is sufficiently well understood. Its variations seem to be chiefly of degree. Sometimes the patient lies for a day only, or even for a shorter period, in a species of exaggerated lethargy. He is senseless and externally motionless, but the pulsation of the heart is still faintly perceptible. Some traces, a slight colour lingers within the centre of the cheek, and of a mirror to the lips. We can detect a torpid, unequal, and vacillating action of the lungs. Then again, the duration of the trance is for weeks, even for months. This scrutiny and the most rigorous medical failed to establish any material distinction between the state of the sufferer and what we conceive of absolute death. Very usually he is saved from premature interment solely by the knowledge of his friends that he had been previously subject to catalepsy, by the consequent suspicion excited, and above all by the non-appearance of decay. The advances of the malady are luckily gradual. The first manifestations, although marked, are unequivocal. The fits grow successively more and more distinctive, and endure each for a longer term than the preceding. In this lies the principal security of inhumation. The unfortunate whose first attack should be of the extreme character which is occasionally seen, would almost inevitably be consigned alive to the tomb. My own case differed in no important particular from those mentioned in medical books. Sometimes, without any apparent cause, I sank little by little into a condition of hemi-syncope or half-swoon, and in this condition, without pain, without ability to stir, or, strictly speaking, to think, but with a dull lethargic consciousness of life, and of the presence of those who surrounded my bed, I remained until the crisis of the disease restored me suddenly to perfect sensation. At other times I was quickly and impetuously smitten. I grew sick and numb, and chilly and dizzy, and so fell prostrate at once. Then for weeks all was void and black and silent, and nothing became the universe. Total annihilation could be no more. From these latter attacks I awoke, however, with a gradation slow in proportion to the suddenness of the seizure. Just as the day dawns to the friendless and houseless beggar who roams the streets throughout the long desolate winter night. Just so tardily, just so wearily, just so cheerily came back the light of the soul to me. Apart from the tendency to trance, however, my general health appeared to be good, nor could I perceive that it was at all affected by the one prevalent malady, unless, indeed, an idiosyncrasy in my ordinary sleep may be looked upon as superinduced. Upon awaking from slumber, I could never again at once thorough possession of my senses, and always remained for many minutes in much bewilderment and perplexity, the mental faculties in general, but the memory in especial, being in a condition of absolute abeyance. In all that I endured there was no physical suffering, but of moral distress and infinitude. My fancy grew charnel. I talked of worms, of tombs and epitaphs. I was lost in the reveries of death, and the idea of premature burial held continual possession of my brain. The ghastly danger to which I was subjected haunted me day and night. In the former, the torture of meditation was excessive; in latter, supreme. When the grim darkness overspread the earth, then, with every horror of thought, I shook as the quivering plumes upon the hearse. When nature could endure wakefulness no longer, it was with a struggle that I consented to sleep, for I shuddered to reflect that upon awaking I might find myself the tenant of a grave, and when finally I sank into slumber, it was only to rush at once into a world of phantasms, above which, with vast, sable, overshadowing wing, hovered predominant, the one sepulchral idea. Hi Athena, happy that you've joined as well. Happy Halloween. Happy Halloween to all of you. From the innumerable images of gloom which thus oppressed me in dreams, I select for record but a solitary vision. Methought I was immersed in a cataleptic trance of more than usual duration and profundity. Suddenly there came an icy hand upon my forehead, and an impatient, gibbering voice whispered the word "Arise" within my ear. I sat erect. The darkness was total. I could not see the figure of him who had aroused me. I could call to mind neither the period at which I had fallen into the trance, nor the locality in which I then lay, while I remained motionless and busied in endeavours to collect my thought. The cold hand grasped me fiercely by the wrist, shaking it petulantly, while the gibbering voice said again, "Arise! Did I not bid thee arise?" "And who," I demanded, "art thou?" "I have no name in the regions which I inhabit," replied the voice mournfully. "I was mortal, but am fiend. I was merciless, but am pitiful. Thou dost feel I shudder. My teeth chatter as I speak, yet it is not with the chilliness of the night without end. But this hideousness is insufferable. How canst thou tranquilly sleep? I cannot rest for the cry of these great agonies. These sights are more than I can bear. Get thee up, come with me into the outer night, and let me unfold to thee the graves. Is not this a spectacle of woe? Behold!" You're welcome, Dr. Fell, and thank you. Hi Stonewolf, happy you've joined again. I looked, and the unseen figure, which still grasped me by the wrist, had caused to be thrown upon the graves of all mankind, and from each issued the faint phosphoric radiance of decay, so that I could see into the innermost recesses, and there view the shrouded bodies in their sad and solemn slumbers with the worm. But alas, the real sleepers were fewer by many millions than those who slumbered not at all, and there was a feeble struggling, and there was a general sad unrest, and from out the depths of the countless pits there came a melancholy rustling from the garments of the buried, and of those who seemed tranquilly to saw that a vast number had changed, in a greater or less degree, the rigid and uneasy position in which they had originally been entombed, and a voice again said to me as I gazed, "Is it not, oh, is it not a pitiful sight?" But before I could find words to reply, the figure had ceased to grasp my wrist. The phosphoric lights expired, and the graves were closed with a sudden violence, while from out them arose a tumult of despairing cries, saying again, "Is it not, oh God, is it not a very pitiful sight?" Fantasies such as these, presenting themselves at night, extended their terrific influence far into waking hours. My nerves became thoroughly unstrung, and I fell a prey to perpetual horror. I hesitated to ride, or to walk, or to indulge in any exercise that would carry me from home. In fact, I no longer dared trust myself out of the immediate presence of those who were aware of my proneness to catalepsy, lest, falling into one of my usual fits, I should be buried before my real condition could be ascertained. I doubted the care, the fidelity of my dear friends. I dreaded that in some trance of more than customary duration, they might be prevailed upon to regard me as irrecoverable. I even went so far as to fear that, as I occasioned much trouble, they might be glad to consider any very protracted attack as sufficient excuse for getting rid of me altogether. It was in vain they endeavoured to reassure me by the most solemn promises. I exacted the most sacred oaths that under no circumstances they would bury me until decomposition had so materially advanced as to render farther preservation impossible. And even then my mortal terrors would listen to no reason, would accept no consolation. I entered into a series of precautions. Among other things, I had the family vault so remodelled as to admit of being readily opened from within. The slightest pressure upon the long lever that expanded far into the tomb would cause the iron portal to fly back. There were arrangements also for the free admission of air and light, and convenient receptacles for food and water, within immediate reach of the coffin intended for my reception. This coffin was warmly and softly padded, and was provided with a lid, fashioned upon the principle of the vault door, with the addition of springs so contrived that the feeblest movement of the body would be sufficient to set it at liberty. Besides all this, there was suspended from the roof of the tomb a large bell, the rope of which it was designed should extend through a hole in the coffin, and so be fastened to one of the hands of the corpse. But alas, what avails the vigilance against the destiny of man? Not even these well-contrived securities suffice to save from the uttermost agonies of living inhumation a wretch to these agonies foredoomed. There arrived an epoch, as often before there had arrived, in which I found myself emerging from total unconsciousness into the first feeble and indefinite sense of existence. Slowly, with a tortoise gradation, approached the faint grey dawn of the cycled day. A torpid uneasiness, an apathetic endurance of dull pain. No care, no hope, no effort. Then, after a long interval, a ringing in the ears. Then, after a lapse still longer, a prickling or tingling sensation in the extremities. Then a seemingly eternal period of pleasurable quiescence, during which the awakening feelings are struggling into thought. Then a brief re-sinking into non-entity. Then a sudden recovery, at length the slight quivering of an eyelid, and immediately thereupon an electric shock of a terror, deadly and indefinite, which sends the blood in torrents from the temples to the heart. And now the first positive effort to think, and now the first endeavour to remember, and now a partial and evanescent success, and now the memory has so far regained its dominion, that in some measure I am cognizant of my state. I feel that I am not awaking from ordinary sleep. I recollect that I have been subject to catalepsy, and now at last, as if by the rush of an ocean, my shuddering spirit is overwhelmed by the one grim danger, by the one spectral and ever prevalent idea. For some minutes after this fancy possessed me, I remained without motion. And why? I could not summon courage to move. I dared not make the effort which was to satisfy me of my fate. and yet there was something at my heart which whispered me it was sure. Despair, such as no other species of wretchedness ever calls into being, despair alone urged me, after long irresolution, to uplift the heavy lids of my eyes. I uplifted them. It was dark, all dark. I knew that the fit was over. I knew that the crisis of my disorder had long passed. I knew that I had now fully recovered the use of my visual faculties. And yet it was dark, all dark, the intense and utter raylessness of the night that endureth for evermore. I endeavoured to shriek, and my lips and my parched tongue moved convulsively together in the attempt, but no voice issued from the cavernous lungs, which, oppressed as if by the weight of some incubant mountain, gasped and palpitated with the heart at every elaborate and struggling inspiration. The movement of the jaws in this effort to cry aloud showed me that they were bound up, as is usual with the dead. I felt too that I lay upon some hard substance, and by something similar my sides were also closely compressed. So far I had not ventured to stir any of my limbs, but now I violently threw up my arms, which had been lying at length with the wrists crossed. They struck a solid wooden substance which extended above my person at an elevation of not more than 6 inches from my face. I could no longer doubt that I reposed within a coffin at last. And now, amid all my infinite miseries, came sweetly the cherub hope, for I thought of my precautions. I writhed and made spasmodic exertions to force open the lid. It would not move. I felt my wrists for the bell rope. It was not to be found. And now the comforter fled for ever, and a still sterner despair reigned triumphant, for I could not help perceiving the absence of the paddings which I had so carefully prepared. And then too there came suddenly to my nostrils the strong peculiar odour of moist earth. The conclusion was irresistible. I was not within the vault. I had fallen into a trance while absent from home, while among strangers, when not remember, and it was they who had buried me as a dog in some common coffin, and thrust deep, deep and forever into some ordinary and nameless grave. As this awful conviction forced itself thus into the innermost chambers of my soul, I once again struggled to cry aloud, and in this second endeavour I succeeded. A long, wild and continuous shriek or yell of agony resounded through the realms of the subterranean night. "Hello, hello there," said a gruff voice in reply. "What the devil's the matter now?" said the second. "Get out of that," said a third. "What do you mean by yowling in that 'ere kind of style, like a cattymount?" said a fourth, and hereupon I was seized and shaken without ceremony for several minutes by a junto of very rough-looking individuals. They did not arouse me from my slumber, for I was wide awake when I screamed, but they restored me to the full possession of my memory. This adventure occurred near Richmond in Virginia. Accompanied by a friend, I had proceeded upon a gunning expedition some miles down the banks of the James River. Night approached, and we were overtaken by a storm. The cabin of a small sloop lying at anchor in the stream, and laden with garden mould, afforded us the only available shelter. We made the best of it, and passed the night on board. I slept in one of the only 2 berths in the vessel, and the berths of a sloop of 60 or 20 tons need scarcely be described. That which I occupied had no bedding of any kind. Its extreme width was 18 inches. The distance of its bottom from the deck overhead was precisely the same. I found it a matter of exceeding difficulty to squeeze myself in. Nevertheless, I slept soundly, and the whole of my vision, for it was no dream and no nightmare, arose naturally from the circumstances of my position, from my ordinary bias of thought, and from the difficulty to which I have alluded, of collecting my senses, and especially of regaining my memory for a long time after awaking from slumber. The men who shook me crew of the sloop, and some labourers engaged to unload it. From the load itself came the earthly smell. The bandage about the jaws was a silk handkerchief in which I had bound up my head in the default of my customary nightcap. The tortures endured, however, were indubitably quite equal for the time to those of actual sepulture. They were fearfully hideous, but out of evil proceeded good, for their very excess wrought in my spirit in inevitable revulsion. My soul acquired tone, acquired temper. I went abroad, I took vigorous exercise, I breathed the free air of heaven, I thought upon the subjects than death. I discarded my medical books. Buchan I burned. I read no night thoughts, no fustian about churchyards, no bugaboo tales such as this. In short, I became a new man and lived a man's life. From that memorable night I dismissed forever my charnel apprehensions, and with them vanished the cataleptic disorder, of which perhaps they had been less the consequence than the cause. There are moments when, even to the sober eye of reason, the world of our sad humanity may assume the semblance of a hell, but the imagination of man is no Carathis, to explore with impunity its every cavern. Alas, the grim legion of sepulchral terrors cannot be regarded as altogether fanciful, but like the demons in whose company Afrasiab made his voyage down the Oxus, they must sleep or they will devour us. They must be suffered to slumber or we perish. The end. There we go. Hi, my pixie dust. So yes, that was The Premature Burial by Edgar Allan Poe. So, Diana Gray, you were saying about me reading some stories by Mr. Davis. What kind of stories would you pick? Because I want to make sure I pick the best one. Well, the best ones. I'm good, thank you, Eat My Pixie Dust. How are you? Happy Halloween. Oh, sorry for the background noise. There are fireworks. Even though they are only to be used when it's bonfire night, which will be Thursday coming. It will be on Thursday. Don't understand why people set some fireworks so early when they can save them, and then they'll end up having more fireworks to light on that actual day. Thank you, Eat My Pixie Dust. It's ridiculous. Nothing I can do, to be honest. So, any of you doing much this evening, this afternoon, where some of you are? Series about chess on Netflix. Oh, okay. Very interesting. The Queen's Gambit is the title. Very nice. Let's see. Let's try some Halloween ones. What? Mr. Davis, sorry, what Anna is saying for me is to read aloud the stories that Mr. Davis himself has read aloud. I will probably watch The Corpse Bride and Nightmare Before Christmas and chill today. Nice, nice. That since those two movies were created by Tim Burton. Let's see what I can find. Just looking at where I need to go to the link to read the story. Can't handle scary / horror films because weak source. Yeah, I hate the ones where with, you know, like the intense moment of what is going to happen next, and you're hugging the pillow and hiding your face so you don't see the TV, and also those violent jump scares. I hate that. I really hate that. Oh, hiding under a blanket. Ah. So, what other stories do you think I could read could probably read one more. Oh, okay. Hmm. Sorry, for not doing anything more at the moment. I just want to make sure I pick the best stories. Let me see. I've read the Telltale Heart on my first live stream of reading Halloween stories. Right. Okay. Let's have a look. Already read The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, The Cask of Amontillado, The Telltale Heart. I'll pick something different from Edgar Allan Poe. Let's try Llewellyn Miller. Okay. Let's see. The audio for the scary Halloween music has ended. That's fine. Okay. Llewellyn Miller by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. Close to the village street stood the one-story house in which Llewellyn Miller, who had an evil name in the village, had dwelt. She had been dead for years, yet there were those in the village who, in spite of the clearer light which comes on the vantage point from a long past danger, half believed in the tale which they had heard from their childhood. In their hearts, although they scarcely would have owned it, was a survival of the wild horror and frenzied fear of their ancestors, who had dwelt in the same age with Llewellyn Miller. Young people even would stare with a shudder at the old house as they passed, and children never played around it, as was their wont around an untenanted building. Not a window in the old Miller house was broken. The panes reflected the morning sunlight in patches of emerald and blue, and the latch of the sagging front door was never lifted, although no bolt secured it. Since Llewellyn Miller had been carried out of it, the house had had no tenant except one friendless old soul who had no choice between that and the far-off shelter of the open sky. This old woman, who had survived her kindred and friends. I think that's how you spell kindred. I feel like an idiot. Sorry, everyone. Kindred. kindred. Okay. Kinman who had survived her kindred and friends lived in the house 1 week. Then one morning no smoke came out of the chimney, and a body of neighbours, a score strong, entered and found her dead in her bed. There were dark whispers as to the cause of her death, and there were those who testified to an expression of fear so exalted that it showed forth the state of the departing soul upon the dead face. The old woman had been hale and hearty when she entered the house, and in 7 days she was dead. It seemed that she had fallen a victim to some uncanny power. The minister talked in the pulpit with covert severity against the sin of superstition. Still the belief prevailed. Not a soul in the village but would have chosen the almshouse rather than that dwelling. No vagrant, if he heard the tale, would seek shelter beneath that old roof, unhallowed by nearly half a century of superstitious fear. There was only one person in the village who had Akla. That person was a woman well over 80, but a marvel of vitality and unextinct youth, straight as an arrow, with the spring of one recently let loose from the bow of life. She moved about the streets, and she always went to church, rain or shine. She had never married, and had lived alone for years in the house across the road from Llewellyn Miller's. This woman had none of the garrulousness of age, but never in all her life had she ever held her tongue for any will save her own, and she never spared the truth when she essayed to resent it. She it was who bore testimony to the life, evil, though possibly wittingly or designedly so, of Llewellyn Miller, and to her personal appearance. When this old woman spoke, and she had the gift of description, although her thoughts were clothed in rude vernacular of her native village, one could seem to see Llewellyn Miller as she had really looked. According to this woman, Lydia Anderson by name, Llewellyn Miller had been a beauty of a type rather unusual in New England. She had been a sight, pliant sort of creature, as ready with a strong yielding to fate and as unbreakable as a willow. She had glimmering lengths of straight fair hair, which she wore softly looped round a long lovely face. She had blue eyes full of soft pleading little slender clinging hands, and a wonderful grace of motion and an attitude. Llewellyn Miller used to sit in a way nobody else could if they sat up and studied a week of Sundays, said Lydia Anderson, and it was a sight to see her walk. If one of them willows over there on the edge of the brook could start up and get its roots free off the ground and move off, it would go just the way Llewellyn Miller used to. She had a green shot silk she used to wear too, and a hat with green ribbon streamers, and a lace veil blowing across her face and out sideways, and a green ribbon flying from her waist. That was what she came out bride in when she married Erastus Miller. Her name before she was married was Hill. There was always a sight of eyes in her name, married or single. Erastus Miller was good looking too, better looking than Llewellyn. Sometimes I used to think that Llewellyn wasn't so handsome after all. Erastus just about worshipped her. I used to know him pretty well. He lived next door to me, and we went to school together. Folks used to say he was waiting on me, but he wasn't. I never thought he was, except once or twice when he said things that some girls might have suspected meant something. That was before Llewellyn came here to teach the district school. It was funny how she came to get it, for folks said she had an education, and that one of the big girls, Lottie Henderson, used to do all the teaching for her, while she sat back and did embroidery work on a cambric pocket handkerchief. Lottie Henderson was a real smart girl, a splendid scholar, and she just set her eyes by Luella, as all the girls did. Lottie would have made a real smart woman, but she died when Luella had been here about a year, just faded away and died. Nobody knew what ailed her. She dragged herself to that schoolhouse and helped Luella teach till the very last minute. The committee all knew how Luella didn't do much of her work herself, but they winked at it. It wasn't long after Lottie died that Erastus married her. I always thought he hurried it up because she wasn't fit to teach. One of the big boys used to help her after Lottie died, but he hadn't much government and the school didn't do very well, and Luella might have had to give up, for the committee couldn't have shut their eyes to things much longer. The boys that helped her was a real honest, innocent sort of fellow, and he was a good scholar too. Folks said he overstudied. That was the reason he was took crazy the year after Luella married, but I don't know. And I don't know what made Erastus Miller go into consumption of the blood the year after he was married. Consumption wasn't in his family. He just grew weaker and weaker, and went almost bent double when he tried to wait on Luella, and he spoke feeble like an old man. He worked terrible hard till the last, trying to save up a little to leave Luella. I've seen him out in the worst storms on a wood sled. He used to cut and sell wood, and he was hunched up on top looking more dead than alive. Once I couldn't stand it. I went over and helped him pitch some wood on the cart. I was always strong in my arms. I wouldn't stop for all he told me to, and I guess he was glad enough for the help. That was only a week before he died. He fell on the kitchen floor while he was getting breakfast. He always got the breakfast and let Luella lay abed. He did all the sweeping and the washing and the ironing and most of the cooking. He couldn't bear to have Luella lift her finger, and she let him do for her. She lived like a queen for all the work she did. She didn't even do her sewing. She said it made her shoulder ache to sew, and poor Erastus' sister, Lily, used to do all her sewing. She wasn't able to either. She was never strong in her back, but she did it beautifully. She had to suit Luella. She was so dreadful particular. I never saw anything like the faggoting and hemstitching that Lily Miller did for Luella. Fagoting and hemstitching that Lady Miller did for Luella. She made all Luella's wedding outfit and that green silk dress after Maria Babbitt cut it. Maria, she cut it for nothing, and she did a lot more cutting and fitting for nothing for Luella too. Lily Miller went to live with Luella after Erastus died. She gave up her home, though she was real attached to it and wasn't a mite afraid to stay alone. She rented it and she went to live with Luella right away after the funeral. Then this old woman, Lydia Anderson, who remembered Luella Miller, would go on to relate the story of Lily Miller. It seemed that on the removal of Lily Miller to the house of her dead brother to live with his widow, the village people first began to talk. This Lily Miller had been hardly past her first youth, and a most robust and blooming woman, rosy-cheeked, with curls of strong black hair overshadowing round, candid temples and bright dark eyes. It was not 6 months after she had taken up her residence with her sister-in-law that her rosy colour faded and her pretty curves became one hollows. White shadows began to show in the black rings of her hair, died out of her eyes. Her features sharpened, and there were pathetic mouth, which yet wore always an expression of utter sweetness and even happiness. She was devoted to her sister. There was no doubt that she loved her with her whole heart, and was perfectly content in her service. It was her sole anxiety lest she should die and leave her alone. The way Lily Miller used to talk about Luella was enough to make you mad and good enough to make you cry, said Lydia Anderson. I've been in there sometimes toward the last when she was too feeble to cook and carry her some blancmange or custard, something I thought she might relish, and she'd thank me, and when I asked her how she was, say she felt better than she did yesterday, and asked me if I didn't think she looked better, dreadful pitiful, and say poor Luella had an awful time taking care of her and doing the work. She wasn't strong enough to do anything, when all the time Luella wasn't lifting her finger, and poor Lily didn't get any care except what the neighbours gave her, and Luella ate up everything that was carried in for Lily. I had it real straight that she did. Luella used to just sit and cry and do nothing. She did act real fond of Lily, and she pinned away considerable too. That thought she'd go into a decline herself, but after Lily died, her Aunt Abby Mixter came, and then Luella picked up and grew as fat and rosy as ever. Poor Aunt Abby began to droop just the way Lily had, and I guess somebody wrote to her married daughter, Mrs. Sam Abbott, who lived in Bar, for she wrote her mother that she must leave right away and come and make her a visit. But Aunt Abby, I can see her now. She was a real good-looking woman, tall and large, with a big square face and a high forehead that looked of itself kind of benevolent and good. She just tended out on Luella as if she had been a baby, and when her married daughter sent for her she wouldn't stir 1 inch. She'd always thought a lot of her daughter too, but she said Luella needed her and her married daughter didn't. Her daughter kept writing and writing, but it didn't do any good. Finally she came, and when she saw how bad her mother looked, she broke down and cried and all but went on her knees to have her come away. She spoke her mind out to Luella too. She told her that she'd kill her husband she told her that she'd kill her husband and everybody that had anything to do with her, and she'd thank her to leave her mother alone. Luella went into hysterics, and Aunt Abby was so frightened that she called me after her daughter went. Mrs. Sam Abbott, she went away fairly crying out loud in the buggy. The neighbours heard her, and well she might, for she never saw her mother again alive. I went in that night when Aunt Abby called for me, standing in the door with her little green checked shawl over her head. I can see her now. Do come over here, Miss Anderson, she sung out, kind of gasping for breath. I didn't stop for anything. I put over as fast as I could, and when I got there was Luella laughing and crying all together, and Aunt Abby trying to rush her, and all the time she herself was white as a sheet and shaking so she could hardly stand. For the land's sakes, Mrs. Mixter, says I, you look worse than she does. You ain't fit to be out of your bed. Oh, them ain't anything the matter with me, says she. Then she went on talking to Luella. There, don't, poor little lamb, says she. Aunt Abby is here. She ain't going away and leave you. Don't, poor little lamb. Do leave her with me, Mrs. Mixter, and you get back to bed, says I, for Aunt Abby had been laying down considerable lately, though somehow she contrived to do the work. I'm well enough, says she. Don't you think she had better have the doctor, Miss Anderson? The doctor says, I think you had better have the doctor. I think you need him much worse than some folks I could mention. And I looked right straight at the Weller Miller, laughing and crying and going on as if she was the centre of all creation. All the time she was acting so, seemed as if she was too sick to sense anything. She was keeping a sharp lookout as to how we took it out of the corner of one eye. I see her. You could never cheat me about Luella Miller. Finally, I got real mad and I run home and I got a bottle of valerian I had and poured some boiling hot water on a handful of catnip. And I mixed up that catnip tea with most half a wine glass of valerian. And I went with it over to Luella's. I marched right up to Luella, a holding out of that cup all smoking. Now, says I, Luella Miller, you swallow this? What is it? Oh, what is it? She sort of screeches out. And then she goes off for laughing enough to kill. Poor lamb, poor little lamb, says Aunt Abby, standing over her, all kind of tottery, and trying to bathe her head with camphor. Hi DJ 1983, happy you've come by. You swallow this right down, says I, and I didn't waste any ceremony. I just took hold of Luella Miller's chin and I tipped her head back and I caught her mouth open with laughing and I clapped that cup to her lips and I fairly hollered at her, swallow, 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 and she gulped it right down. She had to, and I guess it did her good. Anyhow, she stopped crying and laughing and let me put her to bed, and she went to sleep like a baby inside of half an hour. That was more than poor Aunt Abby did. She lay awake all that night and I stayed with her, though she tried not to have me, said she wasn't sick enough for watchers. But I stayed and I made some good cornmeal gruel and I fed her a teaspoon every little while all night long. It seemed to me as if she was just dying from being all wore out. In the morning, as soon as it was light, I run over to the Bisbees and sent Johnny Bisbee for the doctor. I told him to tell the doctor to hurry and he come pretty quick. Poor Aunt Abby didn't seem to know I got there. You couldn't hardly tell she breathed. She was so used up. When the doctor had gone, Luella came into the room looking like a baby in her ruffled nightgown. I can see her now. Her eyes were as blue and her face all pink and white like a blossom, and she looked at Aunt Abby in the bed sort of innocent and surprised. Why, says she, Aunt Abby ain't got up yet. No, she ain't, says I, pretty short. I thought I didn't smell the coffee, says Luella. Coffee, says I guess if you have coffee this morning you'll make it yourself. I never made the coffee in all my life, says she, dreadful astonished. Erastus always made the coffee as long as he lived, and then Lily she made it, and then Aunt Abby made it. I don't believe I can make the coffees, Miss Anderson. You can make it or go without, just as you please, says I. Ain't Aunt Abby going to get up, says she. I guess she won't get up, says I, sick as she is. I was getting madder and madder. There was something about that little pink and white thing standing there and talking about coffee, when she had killed so many better folks than she was, and had just killed another. That made me feel most as if I wished somebody would up and kill her before she had a chance to do any more harm. Bye, Dr. Fell. Thank you for coming. Happy Halloween. Is Aunt Abby sick? Says Luella, as if she was sort of aggrieved and injured. Yes, says I. She's sick and she's going to die, and then you'll be left alone, and you'll have to do for yourself and wait on yourself or do without things. I don't know, but I was sort of hard, but it was the truth. And if I was any harder than Luella Miller had been, I'll give up. I ain't never been sorry that I said it. Well, Luella, she up and had hysterics again at that, and I just let her have 'em. All I did was bundle her into the room on the other side of the entry where Aunt Abby couldn't hear her. If she went past it, I don't know, but she was, and she sat her down hard in a chair and told her not to come back into the other room, and she minded. She had her hysterics in there till she got tired. When she found that nobody was coming to coddle her and do for her, she stopped. At least I suppose she did. I had all I could do with poor Aunt Abby, trying to keep the breath of life in her. The doctor had told me that she was dreadful low, and give me some very strong medicine to give to her in drops real often, and told me real particular about the nourishment. Well, I did as he told me real faithful till she wasn't able to swallow any longer. Then I had her daughter sent for. I had begun to realise that she wouldn't last any time at all. I hadn't realised it before, though I spoke to Luella the way I did. The doctor, he came, and Mrs. Sam Abbott, but when she got there it was too late. Her mother was dead. Aunt Abby's daughter just gave one look at her mother laying there, then she turned sort of sharp and sudden and looked at me. "Where is she?" says she, and I knew she meant Luella. "She's out in the kitchen," says I. "She's too nervous to see folks die. She's afraid it will make her sick." The doctor, he speaks up then. He was a young man. Old Dr. Park had died the year before, and this was a young fellow just out of college. "Mrs. Miller is not strong," says he. "Kind of severe, and she is quite right in not agitating herself. You are another young man. She's got her pretty claw on you," thinks I, but I didn't say anything to him. I just said over to Mrs. Sam Abbott that Luella was in the kitchen, and Mrs. Sam Abbott, she went out there, and I went too, and I never heard anything like the way she talked to Luella Miller. I felt pretty hard to Luella myself, but this was more than I ever would have dared to say. Luella, she was too scared to go into hysterics. She just flopped. She seemed to just shrink away to nothing in that kitchen chair with Mrs. Sam Abbott standing over her, talking and telling her the truth. I guess the truth was her and no mistake, because Luella presently actually did faint away, and there wasn't many sham about it, the way I always suspected there was about them hysterics. She fainted dead away, and we had to lay her flat on the floor, and the doctor, he came running out, and he said something about a weak heart, dreadful fierce, to Mrs. Sam Abbott, but she wasn't a mite scared. She faced him just as white as even Luella was laying there looking like death, and the doctor feeling of her pulse. "Weak heart," says she. "Weak heart. Weak fiddlesticks. There ain't nothing weak about that woman. She's got strength enough to hang on to other folks till she kills 'em. Weak? It was my poor mother that was weak. This woman killed her as sure as if she had taken a knife to her." But the doctor, he didn't pay much attention. He was bending over Luella, laying there with her yellow hair all streaming, and her pretty pink and white face all pale, and her blue eyes like stars gone out, and he was holding on to her hand and smoothing her forehead, and telling me to get the brandy in Aunt Abby's room, and I was sure as I wanted to be that Luella had got somebody else to hang on to. Now Aunt Abby was gone, and I thought of poor Erastus Miller, and I sort of pitied the poor young doctor. led away by a pretty face, and I made up my mind I'd see what I could do. I waited till Aunt Abby had been dead and buried about a month, but the doctor was going to see Luella steady and folks were beginning to talk. Then one evening, when I knew the doctor had been called out of town and wouldn't be round, I went over to Luella's. I found her all dressed up in a blue muslin with white polka dots on it, and her hair curled just as pretty, and there wasn't a young girl in the place could compare with her. There was something about Luella Miller seemed to draw the heart right out of you, but she didn't draw it out of me. She was sitting rocking in the chair by her sitting room window, and Maria Brown had gone home. Maria Brown had been in to help her, or rather do the work, for Luella once helped when she didn't do anything. Maria Brown was real capable and she didn't have any ties. She wasn't married and lived alone, so she'd offered. I couldn't see why she should do the work any more than Luella. She wasn't any too strong, but she seemed to think she could, and Luella seemed to think so too. So she went over and did all the work, washed and ironed and baked while Luella sat and rocked. Maria didn't live long afterward. She began to fade away just the same fashion the others had. Well, she was warned, but she acted real mad when folks said Luella was a poor, abused woman, too delicate to help herself, and they ought to be ashamed, and if she died helping them that couldn't help themselves she would, and she did. I suppose Maria has gone home, says I to Luella, when I had gone in and sat down opposite her. Yes, Maria went half an hour ago, after she had got supper and washed the dishes, says Luella in her pretty way. I suppose she has got a lot of work to do in her own house tonight, says I, kind of bitter, but that was all thrown away on Luella Miller. It seemed to her right that other folks that weren't any better able than she was herself should wait on her, and she couldn't get it through her head that anybody should think it wasn't right. Yes, says Luella, real sweet and pretty. Yes, she said she had to do her washing tonight. She has let it go for a fortnight along of coming over here. Why don't she stay home and do her washing instead of coming over here and doing your work, when you are just as well able, and enough sight more so than she is to do it, says I. And then Luella looked at me like a baby who has a rattle shook at it. She sort of laughed as innocent as you please. Oh, I can't do the work myself, Miss Sanderson, says she. I never did. Maria has to do it. Then I spoke out. Has to do it, says I. Has to do it. She don't have to do it either. Maria Brown has her own home to live on. She ain't beholden to you to come over here and slave for you and kill herself. Luella, she just sat and stared at me like a doll baby that was abused that it was coming to life. Yes, says I, she's killing herself. She's going to die just the way Erastus did, and Lily, and your Aunt Abby. You're killing her just as you did them. I don't know what there is about you, but you seem to bring a curse, says I. You kill everybody that is fool enough to care anything about you and do for you. She stared at me and she was pretty pale. And Maria ain't the only one you're going to kill, says I. You're going to kill Dr. Malcolm before you're done with him. Then a red colour came flaming all over her face. I ain't going to kill him either, says she, and she begun to cry. Yes, you be, says I. Then I spoke as I had never spoke before. You see, I felt it on account of Erastus. I told her that she hadn't any business to think of another man she had been married to once that night had died for her. That she was a dreadful woman, and that's true enough. But sometimes I have wondered lately if she knew it, if she wasn't like a baby with scissors, if she wasn't like a baby with scissors in its hand, cutting everybody without knowing what it was doing. Luella, she kept getting paler and paler, and she never took her eyes off my face. There was something awful about the way she looked at me and never spoke one word. After a while, I quit talking and I went home. I watched that night, but her lamp went out before 9 o'clock, and when Dr. Malcolm came driving past and sort of slowed up, he see there wasn't any light and he drove along. I saw her sort of shy out of meeting the next Sunday too, so he shouldn't go home with her. And I begun to think maybe she did have some conscience after all. It was only a week after that Maria Brown died, sort of sudden at the last, though everybody had seen it was coming. Well then, there was a good deal of feeling and pretty dark whispers. Folks said the days of witchcraft had come again, and they were pretty shy of Luella. She acted sort of offish to the doctor, and he didn't go there, and there wasn't anybody to do anything for her. I don't know how she did get along. I wouldn't go in there and offer to help her, not because I was afraid of dying like the rest, but I thought she was just as well able to do her own work as I was to do it for her, and I thought it was about time that she did it and stopped killing other folks. But it wasn't very long before folks began to say that Luella herself was going into a decline, just the way her husband and Lily and Aunt Abby and the others had. And I saw myself that she looked pretty bad. I used to see her going past from the store with a bundle as if she could hardly crawl, but I remembered how Erastus used to wait and tend when he couldn't hardly put one foot before the other, and I couldn't go out to help her. But at last, one afternoon, I saw the doctor come driving up like mad with his medicine chest, and Mrs. Babbitt came in after supper and said that Luella was real sick. I'd offered to go in and nurse her, says she, but I've got my children to consider, and maybe it ain't true what they say, but it's queer how many folks that have done for her have died. I didn't say anything, but I considered how she had been Erastus's wife, and how he had set his eyes by her, and I made up my mind to go in the next morning, unless she was better, and see what I could do. But the next morning I see her at the window, and pretty soon she came stepping out, as spry as you please, and a little while afterward Mrs. Babbitt came in and told me that the doctor had got a girl from out of town, a Sarah Jones, to come here, and she said she was pretty sure that the doctor was going to marry Luella. I saw him kiss her in the door that night myself, and I knew it was true. The woman came that afternoon, and the way she flew around was a caution. I don't believe Luella had swept since Maria died. The swept and dusted and washed and ironed, wet clothes and dusters and carpets were flying all over there all day, and every time Luella set her foot out when the doctor wasn't there, there was that Sarah Jones helping of her up and down the steps, as if she hadn't learned to walk. Well, everybody knew that Luella and the doctor were going to be married, but it wasn't long before they began to talk about his looking so poorly, just as they had about the others, and they talked about Sarah Jones too. Well, the doctor did die, and he wanted to be married first, so as to leave what little he had to Luella, but he died before the minister could get there, and Sarah Jones died a week afterward. Well, that wound up everything for Luella Miller. Not another soul in the whole town would lift a finger for her. There got to be a sort of panic. Then she began to droop in good earnest. She used to have to go to the store herself, for Mrs. Babbitt was afraid to let Tommy go for her, and I've seen her going past and stopping every 2 or 3 steps to rest. Well, I stood it as long as I could, but one day I see her coming, with her arms full, and stopping to lean against the Babbitt fence, and I run out and look at her bundles and carry them to her house. Then I went home and never spoke one word to her, though she called after me dreadful kind of pitiful. Well, that night I was taken sick with a chill, and I was sick as I wanted to be for 2 weeks. Mrs. Babbit had seen me run out to help Luella, and she came in and told me I was going to die on account of it. I didn't know whether I was or not, but I considered I had done right by Russ's wife. That last 2 weeks, Luella, she had a dreadful hard time, I guess. She was pretty sick, and as near as I could make out, nobody dared go near her. I don't know as she was really needing anything very much, for there was enough to eat in her house and it was warm weather. She made out to cook a little flour gruel every day, I know, but I guess she had a hard time. She that had been so petted and done for all her life. When I got so I could go out, I went over there one morning. Mrs. Babbit had just come in to say she hadn't seen any smoke and she didn't know it was somebody's duty to go in, but she couldn't help thinking of her children, and I got right up, though I hadn't been out of the house for 2 weeks, and I went there, and Luella, she was laying on the bed and she was dying. She lasted all that day and into the night, but I sat there after the new doctor had gone away. Nobody else dared to go there. It was about midnight that I left her for a minute to run home and get some medicine I had been taking, for I began to feel rather bad. It was a full moon that night, and just as I started out of my door to cross the street back to Luella's, I stopped short, for I saw something. Lydia Anderson at this juncture always said with a certain defiance that she did not expect to be believed, and then proceeded in a hushed voice. I saw what I saw, and I know I saw it, and I will swear on my deathbed that I saw it. I saw Luella Miller and Erastus Miller and Lily and Aunt Abby and Maria and the doctor and Sarah all going out of the door, and all but Luella shone white in the moonlight, and they were all helping her along till she seemed to fairly fly in the midst of them. Then it all disappeared. I stood a minute with my heart pounding. Then I went over there. I thought of going for Mrs. Babbit, but I thought she'd be afraid. So I went alone, though I knew what had happened. Was laying real peaceful, dead on her bed. I was sorry to know that, Candy S. I hope your internet does get better. Mine's slow. This was the story that the old woman Lydia Anderson told, but the sequel was told by the people who survived her, and this is the tale which has to become folklore in the village. Lydia Anderson died when she was 87. She had continued wonderfully hale and hearty for one of her years until about 2 weeks before her death. One bright moonlight evening, she was sitting beside a window in her parlour when she made a sudden exclamation and was out of the house and across the street before the neighbour who was taking care of her could stop her. She followed as fast as possible and found Lydia Anderson stretched on the ground before the door of Luella Miller's deserted house, and she was quite dead. The next night there was a red gleam of fire athwart the moonlight, and the old house of Luella Miller was burned to the ground. Nothing is now left of it except a few old cellar stones and a lilac bush, and in summer a helpless trail of morning glories among the weeds, which might be considered emblematic of Luella herself. The end. Well, I think I'm going to call that a night and the ending of reading the Halloween stories to everyone. I thank each and every one of you for joining and listening me reading the stories to all of you. Please like, share and subscribe my channel, and my Streamlabs link is in the description if you wish to donate. I hope you all have a great Saturday, weekend and Halloween, and stay safe, everybody, as well. And I will see you all